Okay, next up is engine, fan, and all that good stuff. So go ahead and get your fan out. And with that came these button head Allen screws. So go ahead and get those out. And then this is your hub. Now the way this goes on is the hub comes from the back side of the fan. All right, and line up the holes, and then the screws go in from the fan side. Now once again, just like I've always said, get some Loctite on your screws and go in a star fashion. So snug, 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 snug. Then go around a second time and reverse the order a little bit. Tighten, 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 tighten. All right? Do it nice and evenly. You don't want to warp this fan. It's plastic. So try to screw those screws down in a star fashion nice and evenly. Let's get the Loctite out. Go ahead and get that bolted on. We'll come back and continue. Okay, next up is to put the completed hub, as shown, onto the engine. Now this design is not a collet design like some motors where you have a brass tapered collet and you can adjust run out. While you can do some run out adjustment on this, and what I mean by that is when you put this on here you can rotate it in relation to the crank, put a dial indicator on there. This design is very similar to the Align T-Rex in a way. It has this split with the two locking screws that clamp it onto the crankshaft, as well as the nut that we're going to put on there. But I've never had to do the run out on this type of hub because there's not a whole lot you can do about it. If it's way out, you might want to check it. If it's way out, maybe the hub's bent, but I basically just put it on and go with it. I've never had a problem on this type of design. But if you want to check it, I've done a video on the Pantera showing how to do check run out. Also, Pinecone did one on the Vibe 50. So if you want to do it, go ahead, but I'm not going to worry about it. What I usually do with this kind of thing is I put it on, and if I've got a high speed vibration, then I come back and start looking at that. Now you're going to want to remove your back plate off your motor, and then you're going to use what's called as a back plate or a motor lock crank lock. This is the safest, best way to hold the crankshaft from turning while you're putting the nut on the fan. The way it works is there's a slot. It'll work on a 90 or a 50. It's got a flat spot up here that will line up with the piston, so it doesn't interfere with it, and it basically goes in the back of the engine like so and locks the crank, and so it can't turn. Now if you don't have one of these, one thing you can do is take the carburetor out, rotate the crankshaft till you see the opening in the crank, and stick a toothbrush in there or something heavy duty plastic. You don't want metal, maybe something plastic. You can stick down in, take the carburetor off, stick down in there, and it'll hold the crankshaft for you. However, not the best way. It works. I've done it in a pinch with a toothbrush. It works. I recommend, for as cheap as these are, I recommend getting the proper tool. Alright, so you're going to go ahead and you're going to put the hub on. By the way, don't forget the thrust washer that came with your motor. Alright, the instructions clearly say to have that on there. Alright, you're going to push this on. Okay, it's kind of a hard push. Alright, if you can't get it pushed on and seated all the way, our nut will do that. Now what I like to do is, on this particular design, most people I know, like on the T-Rex, have not had an issue with using blue Loctite. Some guys have an issue with using red, getting it off, because sometimes it requires heat, a little torch to heat the nut to loosen up the Loctite. But in this application, I always use red. So a little bit of red on there. Alright, and then we go ahead and put on our nut. Okay. And we can go ahead with that crank lock in the back and just take out a socket set and go to town on it. Okay, again, if you couldn't push that fan on all the way, this nut will pull it down. Again, you have to have that crankshaft lock. Now, one thing, I've seen some tools, locking tools that come down in the glow plug and hold the piston. Do not use those. They can destroy your piston and knock a hole in your piston. Those are no good. Okay, so basically let's go ahead and snug that down. I don't know, probably about 25 foot-pounds. I don't know. I kind of guess at it, but I make sure it's snug. Alright, we've got our motor locked. We were able to tighten that down, get it seated up against that thrust washer. Okay, when you pull this out, you should have no in and out run. Alright, so that kind of gets that locked down. At this point, you can put the motor plate back on. We're done with the crank locking tool. Now take two of these screws right here. There's 4 in this bag. You'll see what the other 2 are for in a minute. And go ahead and put them on the split on the hub. Tighten them up evenly. Snug, snug, tighten, 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 tighten them up evenly. You don't want to compress one side and not the other. You want those 2 splits to be compressed. with even pressure. Okay, that will probably help with any run out issues. If you pinch one farther than the other, it's probably going to warp that hub and you're going to get vibration. So tighten those two up easily. I'm going to use blue Loctite on those, and so go ahead and get those in and we'll continue on. Okay, so there we have it, fan on, got the two screws on. Now, one thing that's very common with most of these motors, and I'll just bring it up, is when you put the back plate back on, notice there's a flat spot on one side in that hole. That flat spot needs to go up near the piston. I've seen guys put this on rotated and then wonder why their motor won't turn over because the piston's coming down, hitting the cover. So make sure you get that flat spot up. Alright, last but not least, we got two screws left out of that whole bag. And we're going to go ahead and put our clutch on. So basically it goes on like this. Line up the two holes with the two taller standoff screws here. Okay, and as you see, it's kind of a pretty much straight fit. I'm going to use blue Loctite on these. Blue Loctite, tighten them up evenly again. Don't tighten one and then the other. Do it evenly. Get your clutch on. And that basically gets all our clutch on, and we'll continue on. Okay, before we can mount the motor into the frames, we need to put the fan around the fan shroud and everything, so it's pretty straightforward. There's three of the standoff goodies. Basically lay the motor in there, line up the hexagon standoffs, snap it together, and that's it for now. We're not going to put these screws in because we need to get our motor bolted in and get the clutch stack and everything aligned and the pinion aligned, and then we can go ahead and put these screws and secure the fan to the frame. So at this point, go back into the bags that I had previously opened and get out your motor mount screws to hold the motor in, and we'll come and go ahead and get that in the heli. Okay, so the next part's pretty straightforward at this point. Go ahead and get out the 12mm screws and the washers that we had taken out of that bag back when we were putting the motor mounts and everything onto the frame. Remember, we left all this loose. Left, as you can see, the main gear isn't even meshing with the pinion right now. Alright, so we got to get all that adjusted. But the first part is, what we want to do is go ahead and get this in. Alright, watch any servo wires. Matter of fact, let me get that stuff out of the way now. Alright, go ahead and get this in. Basically comes up at an angle like so. Bear with. Okay, it's a little bit of a tight fit, but it does work. Got to get the fan between the frames. Bear with me here. It's a puzzle. No, what was hanging me up was the fan shroud was coming apart, so you got to get that in between the frames. So you can see that the fan shroud's kind of a tight fit going up. See, it's hanging me up here. Squeeze the fan. There we go. Okay, so now at this point, go ahead and take the 4 bolts with the black washers, the 12mm, Loctite them, and at this point, go ahead and bolt the motor to the motor mount. All 4 screws, get them tightened up, and then we'll come back and do alignment. Okay, so we got the motor mount screws in nice and tight. These screws back here on both sides are loose. As you can see, my engine's still floating around. Alright, up and down all around. Okay, same with the clutch stack up here. We've got these screws loose so I can easily move that around. So what we kind of want to do is let this float around a bit. Now it's sitting on my needle valve until you get nice and smooth gear train. The clutch is not rubbing on it at all, and you've got just a hair of backlash. Alright, so I'm going to push that in a little bit more. Okay, the motor should kind of float with the stack a little bit. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to snug up this side so it can't move, so that pinion can't move. Alright, and make sure that's nice and smooth, but you hear it? Just a little tiny bit of backlash. If you want, take a piece of paper, one regular sheet of paper, cut a strip, feed it down between those 2 gears, bias these screws so it pulls that paper into the gear, and snug them up. And when you pull the paper out, you should have just a little clicking. Hear that? It's ever so tiny. Check the gear all the way around. Make sure you don't have any hard spots. And again, that clutch needs to move freely. Now again, this motor is going to float here a little bit. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to push straight up on it and kind of hold it so as it's pushing, it's level. And then I'm just going to lightly snug up these screws here on this side. Alright, just snug them up. Alright, so that stuff isn't going to move as easily. And then double check everything again. Clutch should not be rubbing, should be super smooth, easy to turn. All right, a little bit of backlash. Yep, looking good. And so that's about going to do it. So again, you want this whole thing in alignment. You don't want the motor cocked in relation to this pinion. What I'm seeing is it kind of floats and finds its own if you've got everything loosened up. So in my opinion, start with the pinion first. Make sure it's straight with the main gear. Clutch isn't rubbing. Have that little bit of backlash. And then go ahead and let the motor kind of float. Push up on it. It helps it push the clutch and seat in that top bearing up there in the one-way. And should line right up. Snug the screws up. At this point, now go on the other side. Take a screw out, Loctite it. Put it back in, screw out, Loctite it, put it back in, same up here, then flip back over and tighten all these up. So these 4 screws here. All right, so go ahead and do that and we'll continue on. Okay, now that we got the motor in, screws all tight, double check again, everything's free there. Now you'll notice without the bottom plate on that you still can flex this frame around, okay, so be aware of that. If you're putting it on the table and you're pushing down on it as you're trying to turn this, it will bind it up, all right? So just be aware that the flame's still flexible to some extent without that bottom plate on there. You might want to just go ahead and do it. Put the bottom plate on. Anyway, again, clutch bell should turn smooth. A little bit of backlash, not much. Okay, and that's basically it. So now go ahead and get your bag out with your fan screws. 3 on each side. Here, here, and here. With the nice little caps. I would just, at this point, go ahead and center it up. There is an adjustment this way with the fan, okay, not really up and down, but this way. So what you want to do is get those kind of snugged up. I'm just going to center it. Then go get your starter shaft and turn your motor over and make sure that the fan is not rubbing on the shroud anywhere, okay? If it is, try moving the shroud around a little bit and then tighten those screws up until when you turn the motor over by hand, you can hear it if you just turn it by hand. You don't need to run the starter, but you want to make sure that fan is not rubbing on that fan shroud. All right, go ahead and do that, and that basically completes motor installation.